With Dr. Norman Dann. My name is Liz Metzger, and I am so happy that we have just about every chair filled tonight. It's a really good sign after having many days where the library was much too quiet for my happiness. So, tonight, our extra special speaker, Dr. Norman Dann, is a retired history professor from Morrisville College, and he probably knows more than anybody about Gerrit Smith, because he has written how many books now about the Smith family?
9.
9. He is a wealth of knowledge and a fantastic public speaker. So please join me in welcoming him for Nuts or Not.
Thank you, Liz. A little bit more on self-introduction here. Never taught history at Morrisville, SUNY Morrisville. I taught a combination of sociology and environmental science in team teaching work. And my colleague, Shirley Crawford, comes to some of these meetings, but I don't see her here tonight. And we were together in the classroom every day for 25 years. And sometimes we had 3 professors in the classroom at the same time. It was very exciting. And you can't teach environmental science without dipping into every discipline there is. The issues are just so complex. So we had to have that interdisciplinary emphasis on the course we taught. The students loved it. I still get comments when I walk through Walmart. People see me and say, "I was in that class in 1975. So I taught at Morrisville for 33 years and loved it, just loved it. It's marvelous. I don't even call it a job. It was just fun. And I never had a bad day at work, and I like to say that because I don't know anybody else that can. It was just wonderful. The students were great, the colleagues and administrators were great. I had a wonderful time. And I retired 23 years ago. So, yeah, I see some people going like this. Yeah, I'm 82, so you don't have to figure all out that stuff. And my brain doesn't work, I get used to, as I'm sure some of us know. But we'll do the best we can with all these sort of complex issues that we're looking at today. This topic of Gerrit Smith's health is a fascinating one that received a lot of press coverage when he was alive, and has had a lot of critiques of it since. So we'll look it over and see whether he was nuts or not. When I give these kinds of talks, I frequently start off by saying, how many of you know anything about Gerrit Smith? You know, before I start, the hands go up and people say, yeah, I do. He was an abolitionist, right? He was very wealthy, right? Somebody's bound to say, wasn't he nuts? He did spend a brief amount of time in a mental hospital for psychological counseling and treatment. And that made a lot of headlines. After all, he was a nationally known, powerful figure. I mean, when one of these people has something go awry, the journalists are all over it. And it makes a lot of headlines, sells a lot of papers. And so it made a big deal at the time. But I've got a question I want to start off with. I usually leave this question until the end. But I'm not going to do that this time. I'm going to ask you a question that I want you to think about as we talk this over. And I don't expect you to answer this overtly, but you can if you wish. If I see some nods or whatnot, I will understand that you're with me. How many of us know someone in the course of your entire life? Do you know someone, it might be a friend or a family member or yourself, but, who has, for whatever reason, needed to have a short amount of psychological counseling to deal with a very difficult problem, after which they were fine? Yeah? I see a lot of noddings. It's not an uncommon issue. It's a very common problem these days where people face unbelievable stresses in their life and have problems with maybe it's anxiety or depression or something that is probably passing, and they need a little help to get through it. So we have psychological counselors around in many venues, and it probably makes sense to take advantage of that. So, as we talk over all of this, keep that in mind. I'm going to do some reading. I probably should explain this stuff first. I brought the books, in case you're interested. The books I've done, these right here, these 6, are all biographical work on the Smith family. There's Gerrit and his wife Ann, their son Green, their daughter Elizabeth, and Gerrit's father Peter. And there is an individual biography on each one. And then this is the one we did last time I was here. Passionate Energies is a synopsis of all 5 of those. So if you don't want to read 5 biographies, probably this is a good one to try first. And then, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. And then there is a dual biography of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Gerrit Smith. They were first cousins. You may have known that. And they worked together in both the abolition and women's rights movements. They became the most powerful leaders of both movements. What a story. I mean, Smith is now recognized as the most powerful abolitionist in the United States. Through in scholarly circles, that's well agreed upon now. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton became at least one of the most powerful leaders of the women's rights movement. And they both learned their tactics together in Peterborough. She lived with them when she was a teenager. My gosh, what a place. This little hamlet in Peterborough. What happened there for human rights movements in the U.S. is just phenomenal. And this is the history of it. And then there's a history of the entire abolition movement and an account of the Underground Railroad as it relates to Peterborough. All right, if you need to look at those later, we can talk about it. I brought a bunch of bottles and some glass. I bring the glass because people wonder where it is if I don't. Gerrit Smith owned a glass factory in Peterborough 200 years ago, and it produced mainly window glass, was their main product. And this is some of the detritus from remnants of their glass-making process. I know where the glass factory was. It's a cornfield now. When it gets plowed, I find this stuff. And I find that people like the history of it, and if you wear earrings or pendants, there's some ideas for you. The bottles I brought, these I love. This is examples of the medical products available to Gerrit Smith. What was he treat? How did you treat illnesses in 1840, 50, 60? There were medications available, and this is what they were. And we'll take a look at some of those in particular later on. And if you want to take time later on, you can come up here and read this stuff, because some of it is really pretty fascinating. I'm going to read a couple of them to you, but that's all. But here's an interesting shot. This is a recipe for cough medicine from the mid-1800s. As follows: 2 egg yolks, 3 tablespoons of tar, 1 tablespoon of honey, 1 tablespoon of pulverized alum, and 1 pint of rum. I suspect after a few swigs of that, you wouldn't care if you had a cough. I used to have an office mate for many years who is gone now. His name was Taze Huntley. Maybe some of you had known him. He lived in Peterborough. In fact, he lived in the house I live in now. When he moved to Vermont after he retired, eventually the house became my home. And it was a complicated mess, but anyway, that's what it is. And I'm still there. But he, every day when he went home from work, he was my office mate, see, so I knew him every day. And he said, every day I go home from work, I mix up a hot toddy. Makes me feel good, and the anxieties of the day sort of melt away. And if I have a cold, I mix up 2 of them. Then I don't care if I have a cold. Well, as you read through these, you'll find that one of the major medications of the day was alcohol. And they're loaded with it. So we'll look at some of those a little later on. But to answer this question about nuts or not, there's an interesting phenomenon that was taking place in the mid-1800s regarding wealth and benevolence. It wasn't an era when many people were very wealthy. In fact, most people were much less than what we would consider to be a standard wage for living comfortably. And those who were wealthy were looked upon with concern by those who weren't, because it seemed contradictory that if they were wealthy, they'd be giving away the money. Why would one give away the money they've earned? Why not just use it and enjoy life? So the thought was that here's Gerrit Smith, extremely wealthy. He would, in our terms, have been a multi-billionaire. And he's giving away, and during his lifetime, he gave away, in terms of what I can trace in the ledgers, about $1 billion in our terms. I don't even know what the numbers mean, do you? I think I could, if somebody gave me $100,000, I think I could spend that up pretty quickly and to my advantage. What's $1 billion like? I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions. That's what he gave away. Wow. And so people looking at this and watching what he was doing thought he was nuts. He must be crazy. They called him two things. They called him crazy or mad. He's gone. He's lost reality. He's given away all of this. So the issue became an important one, especially after Harper's Ferry. We'll get there in a few minutes. In terms of health care in the 19th century, very primitive stuff, and I'm sure you can already imagine that. There were no antibiotics. If you got a cold, you could die. Really. I mean, if it went from a cold into bronchitis or pneumonia, it's lights out. Gerrit and Ann Smith was his second wife. His first wife was his college sweetheart, and she died 7 months after they had been married. Yeah, it was very, very, very sad. And it was 3 years later, he remarried a woman that he had met through his first wife's family. Her name was Anne Carroll Fitzhugh. And interestingly, she was from a slaveholding family in Maryland. She grew up on a slave plantation and was raised by a black nanny. And they had sold out of slavery in 1812 and moved to Rochester, and that's where Gerrit met her, through his first wife's family. Anyway, they married in 3 years after his first wife died, and they had 7 children. 2 of them lived to adulthood. See what I mean? It was a tough time to stay alive. I'm really serious by saying if you got a cold, you could die. There was no treatment for it that anybody could figure out that would work. There were a lot of thoughts, as you'll see, but nothing was really certain. And no pain suppressors. The only really workable pain suppressor was morphine. And that kind of stuff can get addictive. So, I mean, it was a risky business to get sick. And when people got sick, they were really worried about it because it may be the end. And it was for like 5 of their 7 children. They lost 3 children in infancy, 1 to some sort of a convulsive disease at age 5. That was a little girl. And they lost their son, a son at age 12, to dysentery. Yeah, dysentery. What do you do today? You go get some Pepto, and, you know, they didn't know what to do. And it's a dehydration disease, and the kid died. Died in something like 3 days. Dehydration works quickly. Anyway, so the medical institutions weren't really very effective back then. It was often assumed, as far as mental health goes, that one was possessed. Yes, you are possessed by some kind of a demon. And how do you deal with that? Well, you make the body an unpleasant place for the demon to live so that it leaves. Well, how come? Well, the treatments were less than successful. One of them was called trephining. Ever hear that word? Trephining? You bore holes in the skull through the bone to let the demon out. It often resulted in death, which solved the problem, but it was sort of tragic. Other treatments for mental illness, which is what we're talking about here today, were vomiting, induce a lot of vomiting to expel the devil, the demons. Torture the body so it becomes so painful that the demons don't want to be there. Spinning, there were spin chairs. A person would be strapped into a chair on a spindle and spun around so fast, hopefully the centrifugal force would throw the demons out. Well, we sort of giggle at these things, but you know, people at the time were giggling about it. They didn't know any better. This was reality to them, and they were working at it. You've heard of phrenology, probably, which was a technique of diagnosing mental illness by feeling bumps in the skull. And if you had a bump right here, it meant that you were over anxious, or one over here, it meant that you were too depressed. And there are skulls with patterns on them. You may have seen some in the antique shops, which indicate all of the various characteristics of mental health. And if you had bumps or depressions in certain places, this is what your problem was. Again, we smile at these things and giggle today, but really it was real then. People did not understand what caused mental illness. And we'll get back to that in a few minutes. And to emphasize the primitive state of medical technology, let me, in case you don't get a chance to come up here and read all this stuff, this one is extract of peppermint. And 90% alcohol. A few swigs of that, I think you're probably going to feel a little different. And that's what the goal is, you want to feel different. Reduces muscle spasms and flatulence, relieves pain, prevents vomiting, kills germs, lowers blood pressure, reduces wrinkles, cures almost anything. This one, these are tough to find with the labels on them, by the way. I have scoured antique shops for years to find these. This one is pain-killing oil, 79.5% alcohol. Use it internally. Use a tablespoon in a sweetened way to cure cholera, colic, cramps, pain in the stomach, coughs, colds, croup, sore throat, dyspepsia, diarrhea, fever, and ague, kidney difficulties, pleurisy, indigestion, seasickness, headache, and similar ills. Of course, there was no control on medical information at the time. People could write anything they wanted. And some snake oil comes along and it's supposed to cure everything, but it probably just tasted good, it made you feel better. And you can read more of these if you feel like it. But some of them are really fascinating as to the claims of what they could do. And in the long run, rather obviously, they probably did nothing as far as medical technology goes. They might have made you feel better, but there was no cure involved in these things. So this is what Gerrit Smith and millions of others are dealing with for medical technology in the mid-1800s. And no wonder there was concern about getting sick. I mean, the doctor would prescribe this kind of stuff and probably still felt sick. And here's a bottle I picked up just this last summer. There was a physician in Peterborough. His name was George W. Davis. This is one of his. And it says, molded right into the glass, George W. Davis, MD, licensed pharmacist, Peterborough, New York. And here's a little bottle that I assume might have been for some kind of medicine, I'm not sure. But I dug this up when I was searching for some of the glass at the glass factory. So that's a relic from Peterborough. I don't know if it came from there, but it was there. So what was the cases specifically in Peterborough? What was going on health-wise in general and then specifically for Gerrit? Let's look at those two things. 1824, an epidemic of smallpox hit Peterborough. It wasn't just there. It was pretty general around central New York. And it killed some residents of Peterborough and others. There was no cure for it. 1839, measles killed a lot of children locally. You probably had vaccinations, or your children did, But measles, we don't think about these things much anymore because you probably didn't get it or your children won't get it because they get the proper vaccinations for it. But that wasn't the case then. If you got measles, you could die from it. 1843, an epidemic of scarlet fever in Peterborough. I get these dates and information from letters that were written back and forth between Peterborough residents talking about what's going on here now. In 1852, typhoid fever hit the village. These are all killers. And, we say it's tough to stay alive. You can maybe feel why here. But the most common complaint of all, hundreds, thousands, of times in letters that I've read, is disordered bowels. Uh-oh. What does that mean? Well, I think you know what it means. What it really indicates is you have probably been drinking dirty water. That's the source of these kinds of ailments. It's the source of typhoid fever, source of cholera. Gerrit Smith's mother died of cholera. And again, that's a dehydration disease. It works very quickly. 3 or 4 days and you're dead. And the cause of cholera was not discovered until 1854. It was discovered in England. 1854. Gerrit Smith is 57 years old. I mean, his life is almost over before he finds out that if he's still drinking water out of the brook, it's a bad idea. And that's what was going on. So these complaints and epidemics they had were rather often and pretty devastating kinds of things to a family's health. For Gerrit Smith himself, what were his ailments? Well, he had some nasty ones. In 1836, he had an operation for hemorrhoids in Albany, which didn't work. So he had another one in New York City in 1839, 3 years later. That didn't work either. Well, they didn't know what to do to prevent the growth and pain of these things. And it was so bad with him that there were days for decades that he had episodes of pain from it, and days where he couldn't walk or sit. And he had to work with his bland papers business. And he would have one of his servants bring a pile of papers, I suppose deeds and lawsuits and things, that he'd bring them in the house. His office was in the land office. You know where the land office is. That little brick building on the corner, that was his office. And they'd bring papers into the house for him so he could lay down on the couch on his side and work on the papers on the floor. It's the only way he could be comfortable. So he was, he had his significant problems. In 1840, he had an operation in Philadelphia for a urinary tract infection. You get a UTI today, the urologist is probably going to give you a prescription for some antibiotics, and you go home, and in a few days, it's okay. But not then. And even after that, he had a follow-up operation in Philadelphia again, and each time he had to stay in hospitals there for about 6 weeks. So he wasn't always comfortable with life. In 1842, this is a good one, he had what he called spots before his eyes. He said, there's spots before my eyes all the time. I think I'm going blind. Actually, it was psychosomatic. I'm sure you know what that means. It turned out eventually that he was fine, but he was just seeing things that he never saw before because of other things caused by stress, especially economic depressions and panics, they called them then, which were going on in the mid-1850s. And when he became solvent again, he was fine. But, that sort of stuff is worrisome too. He had typhoid fever. That's a quick killer. In 1857, with a very high fever and a lot of pain. And it relapsed. After he got better, it came back. And he managed to survive it both times, but it almost killed him in 1857. So, you get a picture of the general health of the time, the era, the people, and the place. And then the biggie happened. October 16th, 1859. A friend of Gerrit Smith's named John Brown. Oh, I know you recognize that name. Raided Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Yes, it's West Virginia now, but West Virginia did not become a state until 1863. So at the time it was in the state of Virginia. And shortly after that, Gerrit Smith is admitted to a mental hospital in Utica. And is diagnosed with what I think you and I would recognize as a bipolar reaction, a nervous breakdown, something like that. He just lost contact with reality and was having hallucinations and delusions. He couldn't eat, he wouldn't sleep, and it was a psychotic episode. So he was at the time concerned that John Brown was being tried in Charlestown, Virginia for the raid on Harper's Ferry. Fortunately, Brown didn't get killed, or we would have never had a lot of information about that. But he almost died during the raid. He was seriously wounded during the raid, but didn't die. So he recuperated in a courtroom, actually, and was tried and convicted and hung. And as a footnote right here, let's just say this. Many people think, therefore, John Brown's raid was a failure. It wasn't. It was a marvelous success. He died, as did most of his compatriots in that raid. But it accomplished exactly what he had intended it to accomplish. It anchored the South so much that they shot at us at Fort Sumter and started a war. And Brown knew that if the South would shoot at the North and start a war, it would end slavery. That was his technique of ending slavery, to use violence. And the reason he knew that was that the South was so inferior in its development to the North that it couldn't possibly win a war. And he was right. He was right. The North was way superior in everything. Larger population, technology, transportation, communication, all of the tools of war were at the North, not in the South. So the South couldn't win. It took the North 4 years to win the Civil War because they had timid generals. And if you've read anything about the Civil War, you're just going to nod, yeah. But anyway, so Gerrit Smith, right after the raid in Harper's Ferry, which is October 16th, November 7th, he's admitted to the New York Lunatic Asylum, it was called, of all things, in Utica. It was new. It was founded in 1843. And fortunately, the superintendent was a person he knew, a doctor named John P. Gray. We'll talk about him in a few minutes. There's some of his stuff right here. And what happened was, Gerrit Smith was so concerned that John Brown was being mistreated unfairly by being tried for Harper's Ferry, because Gerrit felt that he was equally as guilty as John Brown because he'd given him the money to do it. Gerrit Smith gave John Brown, I can trace in the ledgers, almost $2,000 over 10 years between 1848 and 1859. You've got to multiply that by 70 to figure out what it means today. So he's given Brown like 140 grand to do what? Raise a little army, 20 or so men, train them, clothe them, arm them, transport them, feed them. And he did that, Brown did that, at least in part, on Gerrit Smith's money. So Smith, after the raid, says, Brown has been charged with treason against the United States because it was a federal arsenal that he raided. And I am just as guilty as he is. Take me to Charlestown to be tried with him. This is what he's asking his family to do. This is all written up clearly in a treatise by his clerk, Caleb Calkins. So we know exactly what the family was thinking and doing at the time. The family agreed. And they packed his bags, got him on a horse and wagon, and took him to the train station in Utica so he could be transported to a Charlestown where the trial was being held. Oh, but they didn't take him to the train station. They took him to the hospital. It was a family ruse. And unbeknownst to Gerrit, he ends up at the mental hospital instead of the train station, and he's furious about this. Why would his family do this to me? He was screaming about it. And fortunately, as I indicated, he knew the superintendent of the hospital. How he knew him beforehand, I couldn't find out. But he did know John P. Gray. Gray was an MD, had gotten his degree from the University of Pennsylvania in 1845, and was superintendent of the lunatic asylum, I hate using that word, as it was called, in Utica. And he trusted him. He trusted Gray. So Gray said to Gerrit, you need to stay here with me. Just for a short time. Calm down and come in. Gerrit agreed. And he went into the mental hospital. And he was treated there for mental illness for 4 weeks. After which time, Dr. Gray considered him to be healthy mentally and discharged him from the hospital. Remember my question to begin with? How many of us know somebody who had a problem with some sort of a psychological stress or anxiety issue, needed a little bit of short-term help to get through it, and was fine afterwards? Well, that's what happened. And after he discharged him from the hospital, Gerrit lived with the doctor in his home in Utica for 3 more weeks, just as a trial period, before he sent him back to Peterborough. Gerrit went back to Peterborough and went back to work, and it never happened again. Okay. What led up to it? This is important. This happened in late October 1859. What was the decade of the 1850s like for Gerrit Smith's life? What was he facing? Well, we've already talked about some of it. He was dealing with some rather terrible physical issues like hemorrhoids, typhoid fever, and experiencing periods of vertigo. That's a spell of dizziness, vertigo. That's important. I hope I get back to that later. Remind me of it if I don't. Okay? Vertigo. And this really worried him, that was happening to him periodically. Also in the 1850s, his political baby, the Liberty Party, was falling apart. He was one of the founders of the Liberty Party, which is a third party in American politics. Why did he form a third party? Because he wanted to achieve abolition by political means. He had become disillusioned with other techniques of achieving abolition that weren't working, and thought, well, you know, we live in a democracy. If we can elect enough anti-slavery legislators to the legislative bodies, they can pass laws to eliminate slavery. So let's get started. Makes sense. And so he started the Liberty Party because the two major parties at the time, the Democrats and the Whigs, were both pro-slavery. So he couldn't go there. So they started the Liberty Party. I'll do this very quickly, which over the next decade or so, through a bunch of mergers and coalitions, morphed into what we now know as the Republican Party. That happened in 1854. And the history of that, I'm sure you're pretty well aware of. The Republican Party in that time were the radical, liberal, human rights people. Tain't so anymore, and you know it. But that's because of economic forces that were at work around the turn of the century, 18 to 1900s. But at the time, they were the liberal human rights advocates, and they nominated a guy named Fremont in 1856 for president who didn't get many votes. But they kept trying, and they nominated another guy in 1860 named Lincoln. And you know what happened there. So it worked. But at the time, in the 1850s, this Liberty Party was disintegrating. It eventually merged with a lot of other anti-slavery factions and became the Republican Party. But he was really worried and stressed over the fact that his baby, this new political party, wasn't working too well. Also in the 1850s, he was having marital tensions with Anne. I think you and I would call it a midlife crisis. Yeah. They wrote back and forth in hundreds and thousands of letters, and during the mid-1850s, they were writing to one another, wondering whether or not they ever should have been married. In writing, this is there. In one place, Gerrit, they wrote a lot of poems to each other, poetry, or as Gerrit called them, wretched rhymes, because it really wasn't classic poetry. But in one of them he said, I should have kept my single bed. I mean, it was very clear what they were thinking. And she talked about the fact that the future makes me sad regarding the relationship. If it had been readily available at the time, they probably would have divorced. It wasn't. Divorce was not an acceptable answer to marital stress in those days. And women were supposed to take the brunt of the force and adjust to everything. And Anne was one of those. So that's, I think, what saved it. They came out of it okay, but in the mid-1850s, you hear what I'm getting at? We're talking about the decade of the 1850s. You feel the stress is building up on him? Each step is a little higher pressure. So he's dealing with this marital problem throughout the middle of the 1850s. He's also dealing with raising a rebellious child, teenager. Oh. Green Smith was born in 1842. What is a growing young man supposed to become in the 1800s? The master of the family. It is expected that he will become the family leader, take over the family business, certainly be religious, which was important at that time, more so than now. And Green, as he grew up in his teens in the 1850s, didn't give a rat's about any of that. He didn't want to be a business person. He could see his father working at the land business every day, and he doesn't want to do that. And he isn't interested at all in religion, as his mother and father are, so he won't participate in that. He wants to be outdoors, doing things like watching the birds. He became an ornithologist. Fishing, hunting, hiking. He did a lot of hiking in the Adirondacks, canoeing, taking long trips with friends to the Adirondacks and staying in the woods. And his father is upset over this. The boy doesn't care about the family, and he's off on his selfish own, doing things he wants to do rather than what I want to do. And he badgered the kid for years to the point where Green began to detest his father. It's a shame. It's a sad story. And interestingly, Gerrit Smith detested his father. His father, Peter, that guy was a greedy, selfish, brutal, unfriendly person. The biography of him is difficult to read sometimes. I know, and difficult to research, because his son was the most benevolent, kind, philanthropic person you can imagine. He got that genetically from his mother, I'm sure. I think it's a genetic trait. And he didn't get it from his father. But his mother was more such that way. And anyway, as Gerrit is growing through these stresses of the 1850s, he's facing the fact that his son is rebelling. His son is swearing a lot, gambling, drinking, smoking. These are all taboos in this family culture. So Gerrit reacts in not quite violent ways, but almost, trying to force his son to become what he wants him to become. He wrote a contract, a formal signed contract with Green, that he would stop hunting and fishing and start gardening and sell the produce. Business, of course. Well, no wonder the kid rebelled. But this is going on. Get it? You get it? This is what's stressing him in the 1850s. Then the Panic of 1857 hit. We mentioned this a little bit before. these periodic financial depressions hit about every 5 years back then, and there was no control on money. There wasn't even a common monetary standard. That didn't come about until 1864. Banks printed their own money, and some banks wouldn't honor the money of the one across the street. Crazy. No wonder people were worried over money. And your money wasn't insured. If you've got $10,000 in the bank right now, it's insured. If the bank fails, you're safe, right? You know this. We all have this. Didn't exist then. If the bank failed in a panic, and this happened a lot, you might lose everything you had in the bank. Just liquidated, gone. And one of these hit in 1857, and it reminded Gerrit of the one that hit in 1837, which lasted about 6 years, and which almost bankrupted him. So he's worried over that too. In 1858, he published a book he had written entitled The Religion of Reason. He had ideas that contradicted Christianity. And he thought the Bible, he called it, quote, the most pernicious book ever written, because it encouraged people to believe in things like miracles that couldn't possibly happen in a physical sense. You know, virgin births and resurrections and all these things that just get people confused rather than understanding it all. So he wrote his own religion, called it the Religion of Reason, and he based it on what you and I would recognize as ecology. It was based on natural phenomenon and balance in nature and worship of things that are predictable and sustainable. That was an interesting book. It's complicated to read, but because it criticized existing Christianity, what do you think the press did with it? They vilified it for doing this. And he got hate letters from people who used to be friends and written up in many newspapers in a hateful way. And he's dealing with this on top of everything else he's dealing with. And he also had a problem in the late 1850s with congestive heart failure. That's a physiological problem that results in accumulation of fluid in the extremities of the limbs. And again, nobody knew what to do about it, and he was suffering from that. And then, on top of all this, John Brown raids Harper's Ferry on Gerrit's money. Well, you feel the stressors building up on him over the decade. By the late 1850s, 59, he was on the edge. He was on the edge. He was beginning to lose contact with reality. And then, he after the raid on Harper's Ferry, he becomes highly concerned, logically, that he is going to be indicted for treason against the United States. And in fact, he would have welcomed it had he been allowed to go to Charlestown and be tried with John Brown. Well, all of this resulted in his level of anxiety being sky high and his loss of contact with what was real. That's the definition of psychosis, losing contact with reality. Neurosis, as a psychological ailment, a person is always anxious and nervous, but still in contact with reality, but bugs the out of everybody else. Psychotic is you've lost contact with reality. You're no longer treating anything as real as other people see reality. And as I mentioned, he was having hallucinations. He believed his family and his servant help were plotting against him. It's a self-punishment syndrome that results in victimization not only of oneself but everybody else. And if you ever get involved in that, it's one heck of a mental mess. So the psychotic episode being witnessed by his family led them to take him to the hospital. He got the treatment. What did the treatment involve? The medical treatment while he was in the hospital for those 4 weeks. One major thing was just being there instead of home. Get him away from the stressful situations. These are Dr. Gray's recommendations. This bottle is John P. Gray's solution glycerin tonic, and it's a cure-all, some of the rest of it, but he was involved in medicine that way. And he had Gray had a revolutionary idea at the time. He's superintendent of the hospital, so he's in charge. And he says to people around him, mental illness is not caused by demons. We need to excise this idea from our minds. It's not what causes mental illness. Mental illness is caused by stress. Oh. If you said that to someone at the table these days, they'd say, oh yeah, pass the ketchup. Of course it's caused by stress. We know that. They didn't. This was a relatively new idea. So in order to treat it, what do? You don't drill holes in the head. You remove the person from the stressful situation. So, stay with me at the hospital, Gray says. He did. And there were medical treatments too, sort of. One was a change in diet, and the Graham diet, it was called, was popular at the time, and lots of diets come and go. That one was around then, so they tried that. And the two medicinal compounds that we used on him for treatment of his mental stress problems were alcohol, as you can tell, and cannabis. Now, if you want to change somebody's technique of thinking, that'll work pretty well. And it did. So, it's just coming back around now to be recognized as a mental treatment that might work. So, it was used then, and he was treated with those things, and in 4 weeks he was not fine, but I mean, he was back in contact with the reality of life that other people were seeing, to the point where he was capable of going back into, reintegrating into their lives. That's pretty fast. You know, he wasn't that sick to begin with, I guess, but it worked. So the episode that people wrote about, especially journalists, that called him nuts, crazy, or mad, was a rather, as we recognize it, a rather typical kind of occurrence that happens to many of us, especially in life these days. But I'm not so sure life is more stressful now as it was then. But maybe we have more complicated jobs, and education is more complicated, so it may be more so today. But people at the time in the 1850s faced the same kinds of stress levels, at least, as we do. Gerrit has been written about in other biographical work as being a hypochondriac. You know what that means? Yeah. You're always concerned about your health and worried and complaining to other people and always feel bad and let everybody else know it. That's a hypochondriac. His father was one of those. Every letter his father ever wrote complained about health and how awful he felt. Reading the letters is just depressing in itself. But Gerrit was not a hypochondriac. There was a hypochondriac in the Smith family. It was his wife. She was the one that was eternally concerned about being ill and trying to escape the environment that caused the illness, which she determined was Peterborough. And she typically escaped Peterborough every winter. That makes sense in some ways. But she'd go away for like 3 or 4 months. And she'd go south. South meant Philadelphia or New York City. That was a long way south in those days. And she had relatives that lived in those places, and she'd go and stay with them and write letters back and forth to Gerrit every day, which is neat if you're a researcher, because you learn a lot about the people and the times. And Gerrit, however, was an optimist about his health. He would say, compliments regarding illness make sense. Complaints regarding illness make sense. As you know, it was dangerous to become ill then. So yes, he did complain about getting frequent colds and complained about his hemorrhoids, but he kept working. He wouldn't give up. He was optimistic about his recovery and worked through his illnesses, so I don't see that as a hypochondriac. As he grew older, he was born in 1797, died in 1874 at age 77, which at that time was rather ancient. Not many people lived to be 80 then. It's very different now. And his housekeeper wrote in her diary that during the last 2 years of his life, which would have been 1873 and 4, he had developed a stooped stature and a shuffling gait, typical of infirmities of old age. And the vertigo returned. Oh, I told you we'd get back there. Vertigo. This is episodes of dizziness that come and go. He eventually, in December 28th of 1874, Gerrit died of a stroke. Vertigo is a precursor symptom of a stroke. So he had it with him. He had it coming. His father died of the same thing. Dizziness and a stroke. May have been an inheritable tendency of some kind. The vertigo bothered him, and he wrote about it quite a bit in his letters, and people who were writing back to him were very worried and concerned for him about the fact that that was happening. But that was, as he grew older, that became more common. I see him as a very balanced person. He worked through problems that might have stopped others or caused others to drop out of business or politics. And he was not a politician. People tell me, well, you know, he had a term in Congress, he must have been a politician. He hated politics. He used the word detest. I detest politics. And I don't want to be ever elected to public office. He begged people in his district here not to nominate him for anything for public office because he was not oriented toward public life. He wanted to be in Peterborough and work on the human rights movements there, not in Washington or some Albany. But he got nominated for President of the United States 4 times on abolition tickets. He got nominated for the Governor of New York State 3 times. And he was nominated for the U.S. Congress once in the fall of 1852. And it appeared that there was a lot of support for him. So he made a big deal of publicly asking people not to vote for him. That was his campaign. He went around campaigning saying, please don't vote for me. I don't want to go to Washington. They elected him anyway. Shows you what they thought of him. And his district include what is now Madison and Oswego counties. He had a lot of business in Oswego. He owned a lot of property in Oswego along the canal where it dumps into the lake there, the Oswego Canal. And so we had a business manager up there to handle all the deals. And he was well known in Oswego. People knew him and liked him. And he had been very benevolent with Oswego. They had a major fire there in 1853, and he donated thousands of dollars to rebuild the place. So people knew him and liked him, and so they voted for him, and he went to Congress. And while he was in Congress, this was difficult for him to stay balanced. But he did. He hated the place. He didn't like cities. Well, he lived in Peterborough. He didn't like cities. And he's now here in the nation's capital with a lot of what he called self-serving politicians. He didn't like most politicians. He thought they were there for their own gain rather than to help the public. And he was there for propagating the notion of the abolition of slavery, and the Congress was populated at that time mostly by slaveholders, including the president. And they weren't listening to him. He'd get up before Congress and give marvelous speeches. They're all collected in a book about that, the speeches he gave. Really well researched and well presented and thought out, and nobody listened. They'd all get up and leave. So he finally said, this is nuts, not me. I'm going to quit being a congressman and go back to Peterborough where I can have a real effect on the abolition movement. So he did. He only served 1 year of his term. And he resigned his congressional seat and came home. That's how much he detested politics. So he was not a politician, even though he sort of got a reputation for that. It was a backdoor reputation. It really didn't characterize him at all. But he maintained his balance even there. And I suspect that was rather difficult to do amid people who were calling him crazy and nuts. So there you have it. That's what happened with Gerrit Smith and his health. And he was not nuts. He was pretty well balanced mentally, but he had a short-term problem, as do many of us. And he was fine before this happened when he was 62 years old. He was fine before that, for those 62 years, and after the 4 months of treatment, he was fine after that for the rest of his life. It never happened again. So he was not nuts. And by the way, the clinical case history records of Gerrit Smith's stay at that lunatic asylum are existing. They're extant. They are in the State Museum in Albany. And you can go read them, as I did, and find out exactly what the clinical case history recorded for those 4 weeks. And there's nothing in there about him being mentally ill to the point where he was unrecoverable. It was a quick recovery. Any questions?
So, did Gerrit Smith have a cannabis farm in Peterborough? And was he
Did he have a what?
cannabis?
Cannabis.
Did he grow his own pot?
No.
Well, how would he take and receive some of the treatment? He must have gotten.
I was at the hospital.
Oh,
The doctors had it. You know, so I got some interesting stories about that. It's legal now, I guess, isn't it, to grow it around here? But that's very
somewhat.
recent. Yeah, that's very recent. And I'm a grouse hunter. Does that mean anything? Anybody? If you're a grouser, that's a ruffed grouse. It's a bird, wild bird. And you walk miles and miles and miles and miles and miles over the hills searching and pursuing this bird, and I did that so much that I'm still trimmed. I can't walk as far anymore, but I used to walk many, many, many miles doing that and love that. And I kept, this is in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and it was not unusual to get way back on the property of some farm and run into a patch of marijuana.
Walk around with
They were common around here. And I got over the process of going back to the owner and saying, do you know that up on the back lawn? Shut up about that. I think probably he knew it all. I ran into that a lot when I was grouse hunting.
You could run into it in town in the backyard. In the 70s.
I'm sorry, say it again?
You could run into it in somebody's backyard in town.
Oh, yeah, the
Oh, yeah.
70s stuff.
They grew it in greenhouses. Yeah,
Gerrit's father, Peter,
yes.
you mentioned in your book, he was actually partners with a very famous person.
Yes.
Trade team.
Yes.
What was that person again?
Yes, Peter was in partnership with John Jacob Astor. This is Gerrit's father, Peter Smith. They started out together as teenagers in New York City. He was born in 1768 in Rockland County, down near the city. And he was interested, as a teenager, interested in stage acting as a hobby. And there were some theaters, and New York City was small at the time, but there were some theaters there. And he got involved in stage acting, and that's where he met another young man who was interested in stage acting named John Jacob Astor. And the two of them decided as teenage boys to look around for something that could help them become rich quick. And this was right after the Revolutionary War. There was a lot of land confiscation going on from the British and becoming available for sale, and they figured, hey, we need to get into something like that, and or the fur trade. And they got into the fur trade with Native Americans first and began to get pretty rich. But by the early 1790s, the fur trade was diminishing in New York State and moving west. and Astor followed it west, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Smith did not. Peter Smith dropped out, but he stayed in partnership with John Jacob Astor in land speculation in New York State. And they together owned hundreds of thousands of acres of land in various portions of the state, one of which was what's still called the New Petersburg Tract. And it was 50,000 acres of land in a strip that ran from about Oriskany to Syracuse, through there. This is where we are, where Peterborough is, and it's a complicated legal mess. But what happened was Peter originally leased the land from the Native Americans. New York State, in turn, bought it from the Native Americans illegally. And Peter then, in turn, bought some back from the state of New York illegally. So we still have Native American land claims probably on your property and mine. And if you buy a piece of property now in this region where that New Petersburg tract is, you'll have to sign a little caveat on your deed, which indicates you understand that the Native Americans still hold title to this land. Well, you're never going to lose it. You won't lose it because it's too complicated. They can't do that legally, but they could legally, but won't, put it that way. And eventually the Native American land claims deal will be settled, probably financially, by the state of New York, but it hasn't been done yet. Negotiations have been ongoing for years, but they stalled. Yeah, Peter Smith was an interesting guy. I enlisted the help of a history professor who for a while worked at Morrisville to research and write a biography of Peter Smith, because we needed it. I said, we need this, and you're looking for a project. I've got one for you. And he was excited. She said, yeah, I'll get into that. And he went to the library in Syracuse and got out the papers and started the research and quit. What happened? He said, nobody would ever read about this guy. He was such a mean bee that I'm not going to spend my time researching and writing about a guy like that. So I did it. Had to be done. Nothing had been done. Peter Smith's importance in New York State history is colossal, because we're still dealing with the problems he created. And in the 180 some years since he had died, nothing had been written about him. Nothing. I figured, well, I'll read all the literature on him first and then see what I can. I couldn't find it. So I said, well, okay, let's go to the original papers and get started. So we did. What else?
You haven't said much about your wife, and I mean, I've read some of your books, and okay, I'm an old head and I've forgotten it. But when you were
Me
saying
too.
that they were having that much difficulty in the marriage, and of course she fled to New York City, which sounds to me like a really good idea. Well, you know, I mean, she got away. She went and had theater and museums and friends, and
Right?
and also when you were, I know it's in your books, that he would bring people home to live at the house, and they had a house that was constantly full
Yeah.
of abolitionists, of
Oh, yeah.
female suffragettes, of
Yeah.
etc., that she would have been taken care
Yep. And she was in concert with it too.
of. Yeah, but a hell of a lot of work for her.
But also you realize that because of the status of women at the time, she didn't have much of a choice. Yeah.
Well, that's the other thing, though. He supported women's rights, and yet he used her as the cleaning lady.
Yeah. Even though they had
I
a
mean,
lot
there's
of
a
higher jobs.
contradiction there that's huge.
She was domestic. That's correct. And you're right, the house was frequently full.
Everyone, I mean, there were people that were invited to live there for months.
Yes, that's, excuse me, that's right.
It was in his book.
Cornelia
It was.
Smith, bear with me for a second. Cornelia Smith was Peter Smith's firstborn child. Would have been Gerrit Smith's sister, right? Gerrit Smith is the third born. She died when she was 33, which wasn't unusual at the time. But she had 8 children when she died. At the time, it was not suspected that on the death of a wife, the male was obligated to take care of the children. They're not capable of caring for children with them. So Gerrit and Ann Smith accepted the 8 children into their home to raise them for 3 years. They lived there. Before,
Was that at the time that they had their 7?
yeah, yeah, same time period. And they eventually went back to their father, but it took 3 years before he was willing to accept them back.
Or remarried.
And then later on, they accepted 2 children from one of his wife's sisters who died. And they kept them for a few years. And later on, after that, they accepted 1 child from his brother's family, Peter Shenandoah Smith, his second one, his brother. Because his brother was an alcoholic and didn't feel that he could raise the child after a divorce. So they accepted him. There were other people's kids around a lot, as well as you're referring,
You said that.
visitors. Oh my gosh. Elizabeth Smith kept track of visitors to the home and took a book. I put it in the biography. Over a month or so, maybe a couple of months period of time, at 1 year, and there were an average of 33 visitors per month.
Well,
And they would show up unannounced. They knew Gerrit Smith was philanthropic. They needed help monetarily. Perhaps they just show up at the house and stay a few days because he'd welcome them in. Beggars, drunkards. Yeah, yeah. It was a busy household.
Were their children all educated?
Yes. And that's unusual at the time. They not only went through what you and I would recognize as primary school, there were schools in Peterborough at the time, but they went on to college, essentially. Elizabeth Smith has had tutors at home. I even have their names. It's in her biography. And spent time, a couple of years at Kellogg's Female Seminary in Clinton for what would have been pre-college training. And then another couple of years at what would be, like nowadays, probably a 2-year college in Philadelphia. And this is a female. Oh my gosh. A woman? What does a woman need an education for? They're going to be having babies and cleaning the house. They don't need education. That was the attitude. But she did it. She did it on her parents' will. So they were at least that forward looking for her. And she lived until almost age 90 and became very deeply involved in the women's rights movement. The biography of Elizabeth Smith Miller is an interesting one. She was a reclusive person who might never have become involved in women's rights activity had it not been for the activities of her daughter, who drew her into suffrage. It's a nice story. And Elizabeth Smith Miller and her daughter, Ann Fitzhugh Smith, worked hard at women's suffrage. Neither one of them ever voted because they died before 1920 or 1917 in New York.
And the boys in the family, what did they become?
The boys,
Yes.
the only one that lived to adulthood was Green. And he was the ornithologist
Oh, yes.
and sportsman and conservationist. Green Smith wrote the first conservation laws that were enacted by the state of New York legislature. They were called fish and game laws at the time. And he was that advanced in his thinking about legally controlling the taking of wild game. I nominated Green Smith 3 or 4 years ago to the New York State Outdoorsman's Hall of Fame as a pioneer member because he's dead.
But he never worked.
And he was accepted on the first ballot. Yeah, he was that important.
Did he ever reconcile
brought-
with his father?
You brought that up, because Gerrit and him did get along at the end. That's when he built that beautiful museum and had all the stuff.
The birdhouse? Bill says that Gerrit and his son Green did get along near the end, because Green built an elaborate birdhouse. In our terms, it was probably $1 million building. It's gone now, but in it, he housed 3,000 mounted specimens of birds that he had mounted himself as a taxidermist. And he did it on Gerrit Smith's money. But Gerrit was very reluctant to give him the money to do it, because he said the money shouldn't go to us, it should go to the guy over here in Clockville whose barn burned last week. Or the guy in Fenner who needs to send his daughter to school and doesn't have the money to do it, and he'd donate. That's what he wanted to do with his money. He didn't want to spend it on his son. But you're right, he did. He did allow Green to use a lot, many thousands of dollars, building the birdhouse and stuffing it with stuffed birds.
And then Green donated most of those birds and things.
When Green died in 1880 at the age of 38. Tuberculosis, that's another one of those things, you know? If you got TB today, you get some, I call them horse pills. Great big antibiotic pills, and in a couple of weeks you'll be getting better. Well, in those days, you just died, because nobody knew what to do about it. He died when he was 38. When he died, you're right, his wife, Bessie, donated the birds. All 3,000 of them. She donated the birds to Harvard, Cornell, and Colgate universities to get their ornithological programs started. And the birds still exist, some of them. We've had some of them in Peterborough, and we'll get them back. They're being assayed right now by Colgate University. They looked like they were stuffed last week. I mean, the technique was so good. And it may have led to his death, because one of the chemicals that was used in preserving birds was arsenic. A lot of it.
So Green married, did he have children as
He did
well?
not. No. Green married Elizabeth Fitzhugh, a cousin. And I think they probably, I don't know this, but I think they probably intentionally had no children. So there was nobody there to carry the name of the family on. Elizabeth had 4 children. And they did have children from there. But eventually, all of the segments of the family died out. So there are no living relatives, descendants of the Gerrit and Ann Smith family. We frequently have people, well, probably a couple of times a year, we have people come to Peterborough and say, I'm related to this guy, Gerrit Smith, and I want to learn about him. And I'm gentle. I say, oh, I see. Do you know the specifics about the relationship? Well, no, I just know that Gerrit Smith is in my background. My response is, you're probably right. There were a lot of Gerrit Smiths. There were a lot. It was a common name. It's like John Smith today. And there were a lot of Gerrit Smiths, and you're probably related to one of them. But we do know that it's not this one. Yes?
I don't know about this question, but the name Green
Yeah.
for a first name,
Yeah?
who is that after?
Good question. There was a rabid, radical, wiry, aggressive abolitionist named Beriah Green, who became president of the Oneida Institute in what's now New Hartford. And it was the first integrated school for teaching about abolition in New York State. And Beriah Green was his president, and Gerrit Smith funded him. They became very close friends.
Was he a black or a white? Beriah Green.
Beriah Green was white. Yep. He came from the Western Reserve in Ohio, which was the frontier at the time. He had been an educator there and got hired. There was a guy named George Washington Gale that got the institute going. And I think he died, and when he did, Beriah Green was hired to take his place and came from Ohio to New York State. And he and Gerrit Smith became very close friends, especially because Gerrit had the money and would fund the institution, and so Gerrit named his son after him. Yeah.
I have one, and I think this is from one of your books too, that you said that Gerrit Smith had bought land or had land bought in the Adirondacks as farms
Right.
to be given to blacks,
Mhm.
and then it didn't work out.
Right.
What happened to the land? What happened? I mean, if I remember, it was something to do with the surveyors who found the land that,
Yeah, there were a lot of problems. How much time do we have?
It's up to you. Hold on here.
Okay.
can you imagine?
You don't have to stay. This is the Timbuktu project, it's called. And what happened was, in 1846, New York State had a state constitutional convention to rewrite the state constitution. One of the provisions in the state constitution that the abolitionists were pounding on to get changed was the idea that in order to vote, white males, women couldn't vote anyway, white males had to have $100 worth of property to be eligible to vote. A black male had to have $250 worth of property to be eligible to vote. How does that smell?
A lot of money.
That's state-sponsored racism. Smith was looking at this, and they refused to change it in that convention. The state didn't change that rule. So Smith said, oh my gosh, if that's the way the state's going to be, we will enfranchise some black males by giving them land that they can work and make worth $250 so they'll be eligible to vote. And he gave away 120,000 acres of land around Lake Placid in the Adirondacks to 3,000 free black males to enable them to vote. And in the long run, it didn't work out too well because many of the people to whom the land was gifted didn't have the capital to develop it, or were urban and didn't want to move, or were misled by fraudulent land dealers in the north who stole the land from them. There were a lot of things going on. Anyway, the important thing about that is not the fact that it didn't work out too well, but the fact of the nobility and philanthropy of the act. He got a lot of press trying to help black people become more equitable in their
Oh,
treatment.
it's a genius idea, but it's just not a lot of farming in Lake Placid.
Yeah. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Thanks very much for coming. If you'd like to read some of this medical stuff, or buy some Peterborough glass or a book, I'm here.
Or buy his book.
Thank you all very much for coming.
The way I did.